Hello, I am Richard Horton, and this is my American Political Theory final presentation on my paper. I did my paper on pro-slavery versus abolitionist views in the antebellum period, and I hope you enjoy it. So in my paper, I begin with our nation's founding, and I touch base a little bit on the issue of slavery in the Constitutional Convention. So we'll go ahead and talk about that. Just a quick background on some of the founding fathers, the ones that were at the convention. The convention was made up of delegates from 12 states. All the 13 original colonies sent delegates, with the exception of Rhode Island, who was afraid of losing their state sovereignty. Out of the 55 delegates there, about 25 of them owned slaves and were slave owners. So close to half of the delegates there were slave owners. So the Constitutional Convention was presided over by George Washington, who himself was a slave owner. His estate at Mount Vernon had, I think, over 300 slaves, but he himself only owned about half that number because the other half was owned by his wife, who inherited them from her deceased first husband, and by law they had to remain in the Custis estate. So at the end of George Washington's life, in his will, when he freed his slaves, he did not have the authority to free the slaves of his wife. They, by law, had to go to her grandchildren. But his slaves were eventually freed. Just reading about his views on slavery, which really changed and evolved throughout his life, they're very conflicting and contradictory. Just reading about that is very interesting. So I recommend looking into that if you're interested. I actually have a book called Washington Alive by Ron Chernow, and it's a really good biography on Washington, and it does touch base on that subject. So I find it pretty interesting. But one of the biggest debates at the Constitutional Convention, most contentious debates, was the debate about slave trade. So a lot of the more anti-slavery delegates there wanted to outlaw the importation of any more slaves to the United States. The southern states were not very happy about that proposition. They thought it should remain a state issue and that the state should have control of that kind of thing. Interestingly, delegates from Maryland and Virginia who owned slaves were speaking out against slavery in this debate. George Mason was one of them. He was a Virginian delegate. He had hundreds of slaves, and he denounced slavery, which you think is kind of hypocritical. And actually, South Carolina and Georgia, who were completely opposed to any kind of regulation on slavery, argued that the Virginians were being hypocritical because they didn't need any more slaves. They had plenty, whereas South Carolina and Georgia relied on slave importations to keep their slave population where they needed it to be. I think rice was a pretty big crop in that area at the time, and it was not fun to work those crops, apparently. So eventually the Constitutional Convention was able to put the issue to rest for the time being by implementing the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 comes from the slaves being counted as 3/5 of a person for census reasons, and this allowed for extra representation in Congress by the southern states, but not as much as if the slaves were counted as an entire person. So it's kind of something that both sides could agree to. It was the South felt like it was somewhat of an advantage to them, but not as much as they wanted, and the North didn't have to completely count slaves as population, even though they weren't citizens. So it was kind of a win-win or lose-lose, depending how you look at it. Unfortunately, the compromise also did not allow the federal government to regulate the slave trade federally until, I think, 20 years from the date of the Constitution's inception. So unfortunately, the compromise put the issue to bed very temporarily. It was a contentious issue throughout our history and up until the Civil War period. So we're going to go and jump to that period now. So we're going to talk about the antebellum era, right? Pretty much in the few decades previous to the Civil War erupting. So we're going to begin with the pro-slavery side of the debate. This picture is actually a representation of the states that seceded from the Union and were a part of the temporary Confederate States of America. However, I do want to mention that this by no means implies that slavery was exclusive to the South. Oftentimes, that's a remark that seems to be accepted by many. But as we'll talk about a little bit later, slavery was also in the North, obviously, but even at the period right before the Civil War, there were many people that were pro-slavery, and there were abolitionists in the South as well. So it's pretty mixed, although predominantly slavery was at that point ingrained in the South. So we'll start with the economic arguments for the pro-slavery side. The South was heavily agrarian, and as such, they didn't have enough labor to man all of their agricultural endeavors, so they relied on slave labor. They did not take advantage of the Industrial Revolution the way that the North did, and we'll talk more about that here in a little while. They also argued that freeing slaves would lead to mass unemployment, and which would cause violent unrest eventually. And they also argued that they needed slavery to keep the economy afloat, that they depended on slavery at this point, and to get rid of it would basically destroy the South. There were also more moral arguments that the pro-slavery side used in the debate. They like to claim that slavery came from God. They use the Bible actually in quite a bit of these arguments, mentioning that one of the 10 Commandments that talks about coveting your neighbor also mentions manservants, aka slaves. They also talk about how in the Bible Abraham was a slave owner. They mention a story in which I think it's Moses, I'd have to look again, returns a slave to someone. They also mention that slavery was very prevalent in the Roman Empire during Jesus' time, yet he never spoke ill of it, or never really even mentioned it in the Bible. Slavery also allowed Africans to be introduced to Christianity. It introduced them to civilized society, and it gave them a better living situation than they otherwise would have had. So it went from slavery being necessary to the South to basically it being a good thing for the slaves. They felt like they were doing the slaves a favor by keeping them in involuntary servitude. So now we'll go ahead and touch base on a few of the abolitionist views in the debate before this thing gets too long. So we'll start with economics. Basically, the North, their arguments, they didn't have, they weren't really based on economics so much as they were moral arguments, which obviously for them was much easier. It was much easier for them to make moral arguments against slavery. But there were some economic factors involved. The Industrial Revolution, basically industrial growth, took off in the North, whereas the South largely ignored it. Actually, interestingly enough, a lot of the industrial growth, such as the advent of the cotton gin, etc., kind of helped slavery and actually increased the demand for slaves in the South because they needed more cotton for the cotton gin and cotton mills and the textile industry in the North to keep growing. So cotton was very important to the mills and the textile industry in the North. It was also extremely important to Great Britain and their textile industry. And they also exported the majority of their cotton from the South the southern United States. But those cotton exports were actually shipped from northern ports. So the North benefited in that way as well. So the North wasn't completely, devoid of a need for slavery. However, they weren't nearly as reliant on it as the South, largely due to industry. They moved from an agricultural society to an industrial one. You can see that in the Civil War, where the North had was able to produce much more in the way of supplies, artillery, things of that nature, because they were industrialized. And the outcome of the Civil War affected them much less than it did the South. Of course, a lot of the battles were fought in the South, the majority of them were. But even so, they had an industrial advantage during the war, and that helped them tremendously. But the North, they really focused on the moral aspect of slavery. They felt it was incredibly wrong. One of the religious arguments they used to counter the pro-slavery side was that God created all men in his image, and that included slaves. They also discussed that slaves, most pro-slavery people, and even some abolitionist people, felt that Black Americans and white Americans were not equal, that the races were not equal. And like I said, even some abolitionists believed that. They believed they should be free, but they weren't necessarily equals. Their ethnicities weren't. However, to counteract that, some abolitionists made the argument that slaves were capable of learning. This was could be viewed with examples from people such as Frederick Douglass and others that actually wrote intelligent works of literature and gave intelligent speeches, were very civilized, and that slavery was just wrong, and it reflects poorly on the nation. That was a sentiment expressed during the Constitutional Convention as well. Some of the people were disgusted by it. They felt that it would look really bad on the country to continue slavery, but at that time it was about keeping all the states together in the Union when the nation was first created. And actually that was a large part of Abraham Lincoln's reasoning at the beginning of the Civil War. He said he did not want to interfere with slavery where it was already established, and that was because he wanted to keep the Union together. Eventually, during the Civil War, he changed his thoughts on this and was in part responsible for the abolition of slavery. But there was also a women's rights connection in the North. Women's rights movement began around this time in the North. I think the Seneca Falls Convention, it was the first women's rights convention, and this actually brought to light some Black women that were anti-slavery as well, and the two movements kind of became pretty closely connected. And in fact, one of my resources for my paper mentioned that some of the Southerners after the Civil War didn't want to pass women's rights legislation because they still felt begrudged at women for their anti-slavery sentiments previously. So that's pretty much what my paper was about. It was just kind of a compare and contrast paper and gave food for thought as to why the slavery issue was not settled without the Civil War. And in my opinion, it could not have been without some part of the Union breaking away, as evidenced by the Constitutional Convention when some of the southern states like South Carolina and Georgia threatened to break away if slavery were threatened. So if they wanted to keep the Union together at some point, there was either going to be constant compromise like there was for some time, or there was going to be some sort of conflict, which eventually there was with the Civil War. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought, and thank you for listening.